Okay, so today I want to discuss the concept of audience. Unfortunately, audience is a difficult topic because it requires that you really understand the people that you're writing to, and this can be tricky. So I want to start with some basic concepts. Who could be the audience of your paper? Or more generically, the audience of something that you've written. So I want to start with something that's more accessible. And the first concept, your audience could be whoever is following you on social media. So I don't suggest this group for your paper, but because it might be the easiest concept to begin to deal with, I'm going to start here anyway. So you, in theory, have a basic concept of who's following you or what kinds of people are following you on your social media accounts. So based on your previous posts, you know who you were likely to draw. You perhaps know what kind of political convictions they might have, or what kind of religious convictions they might have, or what their general ideology is. In other words, the beliefs that inform their lives. Maybe, we'll just pretend for a moment, your dad is a police officer or a firefighter. So maybe over the course of your life, you've actually been very involved in, say, supporting firefighters. And maybe you have drawn through your social media posts other people who either are firefighters or are family members of firefighters, and they're kind of all rolled up in the same cause with you. That's not a strictly political or religious thing, which is why I wanted to use it as an example. It's just something else that you might be involved with, something else that you might care about that's some kind of cause, all right? Or conversely, maybe you're really passionate about animal rights. So you have drawn through your social media accounts and your posts other people who care about animal rights. So you already know this. So if you wrote a blog post, we'll just go with blog post for now, and you were going to discuss animal rights, or you were going to discuss a fundraiser upcoming for firefighters, or some other longer post where you're going to talk about, say, how police departments are underfunded, or the firefighters are underfunded, or the local animal shelter also is underfunded, like whatever, then you kind of know who these people are, and you know how to talk to them, how to interact with them. You would know what to say to get their attention, what to say to get them to care about this particular thing you want to talk about. All right? Now, let's move one category over. Me. So most students, generally speaking, probably do imagine that their instructor or their teacher or their professor is the target audience of their paper. Now, obviously for this class, that's fine if you want to imagine that. You do need to keep track of something like this, though, because in some classes, your professor or instructor might say, this is the target audience for this paper, and then they would tell you, and then you would need to adjust for that audience. But if they've left it up for you to just imagine, then what does it mean to imagine that I am the target audience? Well, first of all, it means that I am educated. I have a PhD. I have a PhD specifically in rhetoric and composition, which is a field inside of the larger branch that is English. So there are some things you don't have to explain to me. You know, you say to yourself, my audience has a college education. But you would also know that I am an English professor. So let's say you're going to talk about environmental science. Well, you don't know how much I do or don't know about environmental science. This means you would need definitions, or you would need an explanation. You need to explain things. You know, there are certain types of jargon that I would not know because I am not in environmental science. But if you went to biology class and your biology professor says, I want you to write a paper about, and then they say, hey, this topic, then, your biology professor has a PhD in biology. There are all sorts of things that you don't have to define or explain for them, unless they want you to imagine a more general audience. This is a good time for me to point out, you need to ask your professor. Just ask them point blank. Is there a specific audience that you imagine that I'm writing this paper to? Am I writing it to you as a professor? am I writing it to a general audience? You know, the general audience, where you don't know what their education level is, will still need definitions, explanations, and for you to explain any specific jargon. You know, if I say, hey, does this poem have alliteration in it? Alliteration is jargon specific to the field of English, you know, discussion of literature and poetry, right? You would have to explain what alliteration is if you were talking to a general audience that would know. You know, this audience over here following you on social media, they probably don't know what alliteration is. Maybe they remember it from school, maybe they don't. You would need to explain. The other thing that you can do is to imagine that, you know, whatever journal you've used the most, like maybe you found a journal and you used 2 articles from the same journal just from different years, or in general, the journals that are tied to your topic, your field in the database. You can imagine that the scholars that write for these journals are your audience. Again, the scholarly audience is educated. And not only that, they're going to be educated in that specific field. You know, again, using alliteration as a concept, you don't have to explain to me what alliteration is. You can just start talking. You know, you don't have to explain to scholars who specialize in the study of human DNA, you don't have to start all the way back at, so, you see there's this double helix thing. You know, there are certain things you take for granted. They're supposed to know it already. So this is a field-specific thing. You don't have to stop and explain the jargon. It's not necessary. The only reason at this point that you would need definition is when definitions are contested. So you're like, okay, for the purposes of this discussion, I will define, I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head, but you know, a basic concept that's up for debate. You know, I will define this as this. So we'll use education. If I say, okay, for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to define a typical college student as someone between the ages of 18 and 22. You've said up front that that's how we're going to define it, and then for the rest of the paper, you're saying, I'm going to talk about college students who are 18 to 22. The reason why this is important is there are plenty of non-traditional college students. They have already gone out into the world, they've already worked a job, maybe they even already have a bachelor's degree in something else, and now they've come back to college and they're getting a second bachelor's degree. I mean, there are all sorts of things that happen. So the acknowledgement that a college student doesn't have to be 18 to 22 years old is actually really important. So that is narrowing the discussion by stopping to define a term that people would otherwise perhaps take for granted or agree to. And you're like, well, no, I need to stop and explain. This specific part of this concept is what we're talking about right now. So, to a certain extent, the issue of audience has to do with what can you expect them to believably already know? But the other part is, what do they believe in? So, if you're imagining the entire country, the United States of America, you know we have a very wide range of political beliefs and a very large number of different religions, and those kinds of things are going to impact what you say. If you narrow the audience down and you're like, I'm only going to talk to biologists about biology, you've narrowed in the scope pretty carefully to say, we're just going to talk person to person, scientist to scientist about science. So this is very broad, and this is very narrow. So ask yourself, who am I aiming this at? And therefore, what do I need to take in consideration about what they may or may not already know and what they may or may not already believe? Because you may have to slow down and define some things or discuss some concepts in order to bring them onto the same page with you. And this would be why audience matters. Alright, so do also read your class reading. The book discusses more things about audience that you will need to know. This is only one small part of a much broader topic.